Hello and welcome to Quilt Addicts Anonymous. I'm Stephanie Soebbing. We've got a very fun replay for you today. We are doing the SIY Patch Pocket Bib Apron. It's a mouthful, but it's a fun pattern. You're going to learn lots of really great techniques, including fussy cutting, cutting templates, how to gather, how to turn corners, how to line things. It's really fabulous, and the pattern is 100% free. That's brought to you by our friends over at Jaftex. They created the SIY Sew It Yourself program to help sewers learn new skills. And so each project teaches you a new skill set. In this one, you learn a whole bunch. And also for experienced sewers, it's just a nice, fast, fun project. This is one of the ones that they've come out with that does take a little bit more time, but an apron can absolutely be an heirloom project. I have, and I use on special occasions, an apron that my great-grandmother hand pleated or hand smocked. And that is what comes out when I've got family over at Thanksgiving, because it is special and it is fabulous. So if you make one of these, and this could also become the special apron that is used. We've got some new kits, which is why we're sharing the tutorial with you guys again today. One of the new kits that we have is Bonjour Paris. This is from FreeSpirit. It's gorgeous, it's frilly, it's all the things that you think of when you think of a fancy girls' day making some cupcakes in the kitchen. I know I used to, and still do, love baking with my girls, and they love it too. So this could be a really fun one to have for that. It has Paris scenes. We have the lovely windows, we've got some bicycles and flowers, we have some French songs, and then we have some fashionable ladies who are going out about the town. And then we have this lovely floral for the lining, and then we actually have Bonjour Paris and some Eiffel Tower scenes in the layered apron, because, you know, it's a fancy apron. Like, you can make a simple apron. This is a fancy apron. So you can have all the things, you can pull it out on your special occasions, and then it can just, you know, be a fancy one for when you have entertaining. It's a fun one. This is the apron that I made. I forgot to tell y'all, I'm the host of SIY, and we're going to be continuing it next year with even simpler projects. So that'll be coming to you this fall, so that'll be exciting. This one is Dark Forest. So this is one of the other Jaftex companies. This is the one that I made on camera, so you can follow along step by step. It also has these fabrics in all of the instructions. So if you're someone who has trouble seeing it in another way, this is the one you'll want to grab. I think this would be great for anybody who really likes nature and the outdoors, or maybe lives in like a North Woods type area, has a cabin. This would be fun for you because it definitely is reminiscent of all those things, both with the colors, and these are all different phases of the moon, but also we have a little bit of pink or purple in there, but we have all of the different leaf specimens here. We have that pocket that really makes it fun. And then we also have some of the green leaves on the inside with that sprig, and some mushrooms. Mushrooms are really popular right now. So we've got those two options for you. We've got Dark Forest, and then we also have Bonjour Paris. Two totally different looks, exact same pattern. But remember, the pattern is free. You can grab it on our website, shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com. So go check that out, grab a kit. These are the last kits we're going to have. I believe the first one that we got with this is sold out, and this is it. This is the only ones we're going to have. There are not going to be more variations. So if you want one, grab them while we got them. All right, let's watch that replay. So when you're making the apron, changing up the fabrics is going to absolutely change up the look of the entire piece. So you can make this a couple of times. So you can have maybe seasonal aprons, or just one in different colors if you decide to change up your kitchen scheme. There's so many possibilities. But if you get one of the kits from an SIY retailer, the first thing you're going to want to do is make sure you're separating the fabric so you know what part of the fabric is going to correspond with which number piece. So I did this when I first got started. I had my, map from the Jaftex family of where everything was supposed to go. And I really like to use blank address labels. You can get these from the office supply store. And I just write down the number first of the fabric, and sort that through so I know what's going where. And then as I'm cutting the pieces, I also am writing the number of what piece it is on there, and I'm replacing that. That way I'm all organized from the start. Nothing's going to end up where it's not supposed to be, and you don't have to constantly be second guessing yourself or referring back to pattern notes. There's just a sticker on your fabric that'll go away later. Now the next thing I'm going to show you how to do is how to cut your fabric. So this is going to be for piece 1. I have piece 1 marked on here because I know that this is the fabric we're using for it. Others of them, you know, maybe if they went for multiple pieces, I would have written all the pieces that they go to on here so I know what I'm supposed to be cutting from it. Now this one, and you'll want to do this anytime you have directional fabric or anything that has like a straight line in it. You want to make sure that when you cut it, that it is going to look straight when it is on the final product. So for example, this one here is going to be our bib front. So we want to make sure that this line here, that those circles are straight across, because if they're not straight across, when we put it together, it's always going to look crooked, and you do not want the girls to look crooked. Nobody wants that. So I'm going to show you how to line that up so that way you can cut your pieces out. It's like fussy cutting, but not quite as intense. But you certainly could fussy cut if you want to. We've got other SIY videos that go through that. Check out our patchwork pillow. We go through it in depth there. But I'm just going to show you how you can line everything up if you have something that looks like a straight line like this. All right, so if we're just looking to how this was cut when it was sent to me, you can see that they cut to a specific yardage mount, but that was not super even with where these circles are ending. But I want those circles to be nice and straight across the bottom, again, so it looks nice at the bottom of that bib. So what I'm going to do is I'm lining my ruler up and getting that edge nice and even with the bottom of every single circle. Then I can just go ahead and slice that off, slide it down, and continue going straight up like that. So I'm gonna, in this case, line it up. I've got my ruler a little bit in line down here, so that way I can tell that I'm still in line with what I've already cut. And then I'm gonna make any adjustments needed up higher to make sure, again, that I'm still just slicing right at the bottom of that circle. So this is obviously not a lot to come off, but now we have a nice, great flat surface to work with. So that way when this is laying across our bosoms, it's going to be nice and straight. Everything is going to look good. You won't start off looking crooked from the start. So anytime you have anything that's directional or have lines in it, this is what you want to do. You're going to cut it one width at a time to get it nice and straight all the way across. Then you can start cutting out your pieces. So this pattern, which is available for free from an SIY retailer, which you can locate at siysewitusself.com or at sewforhome.com, you can see and get this pattern. And this is really great because they do list out exactly what you need of which piece, but they also have a graphic design of all the pieces that you're going to use, and it has their measurements on there. So if you want, you can just check this off as you're going to make sure that you get everything. Right now I'm going to cut my bib, which is 12 by 9.5. Again, if this is directional, the 12 is going to be this way. So you want it to be going up and down across the 9.5 inch part. All right, so I'm taking my edge that I just trimmed down, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to line my selvages together at the bottom here. And then I'm going to get all my edges lined up, and that will be good enough to be able to just slice straight across so you don't have to worry about cutting this single width, and we can use our mats to measure. So what I'm doing here is I'm lining up the edge of that fabric with a 0-inch line on my mat. And then I'm going to line, and this is super important, that fold up with the 1-inch line. And as long as we're square at our 1 inch and at our 0, then we will have a nice straight cut as we cut across. So I'm going to go ahead and cut at 9.5, where I can just lay my ruler down so that it's even with 9.5 on the mat, both at the top and at the bottom. And I know, because I've got everything lined up at the 0, that I'm going to have a straight 9.5 inch cut without having to have a special ruler. And because we took the time to square everything up, my circles are nice and straight across as well. So we're going to have a really nice piece to work with here. So now I'm going to unfold this, and I'm going to use a mat to measure again. This time I've got my selvage edge hanging past the mat, and just the top edge with any inch line is fine. So now we're going to cut it at the 0 and the 12-inch mark so that we can create that 9.5 by 12 piece. Now your apron is going to come with 2 pattern templates. They're included in your pattern, and we talked about this in our last SIY video where we did the reusable grocery tote, that you want to make sure you are choosing the 100% scale when you're printing these. If you choose the fit setting, your pattern is likely going to turn out too small. But the best way to make sure that you've done it correctly is there's this line here that says confirm your printer output is accurate. This bar is exactly 6 inches long. So what you want to do is just take your ruler, line it up, and if it is exactly 6 inches long, then you did that correctly. And if not, then you just need to adjust your scale back to 100%. If you're having trouble, a copy shop or a library is always able to help you with that step. So this is a bib trim. We're going to use that a little bit later, but I've already cut out my apron bib template, which is what we're going to use to create the angles that are going to be on that apron bin. So what I'm going to do first is just fold these guys right sides together. And you could pin this. I typically do not. You also could use pattern weights. I typically do not. What I like to do is on this fold here, so we have our 2 sides here, is I'm just going to place on the fold line. It'll say to do that on your pattern. We'll just get that in place, and then we're able to just slice right off and create that angle. So I just line my ruler up with that edge, and then I can give it a slice. Now we've got our apron bib ready to go. You're going to do this with lining as well. Lining doesn't matter as much if it's perfectly straight, but definitely take some extra time to make sure that if you have anything that might look crooked, like this would definitely look crooked if we didn't take the time to square that up to the print, then make sure you're doing that. All right, so let's get sewing now that we know how to cut everything. So for this first section, we're going to need our bib front in both the part that's going to be facing out and the lining, plus our trim, which is going to go on top. What we're going to do for each of these is we're going to lay these right sides together, matching those long ends on the top of your apron and the bottom of your trim. And we're going to sew this with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now, if you're coming from the quilting world, that might be a little strange. I'm going to show you how to find it on your sewing machine. So every machine has these marks on them, and when you have your fabric lined up with them, you're going to sew that seam allowance when your needle is in its center position. So for example, right here we have 5/8. So the easiest way to figure out where your 1/2 inch is on your machine is to take a needle or your ruler and just put it right underneath where the mark is. So here we are at that center line is lined up right under my needle, and then using my hand roller, I like to lower that down just so I know exactly where we're at. So I can see really clearly that when my needle is in the center position, if I have my fabric lined up with this 5/8 inch mark, that I'm going to sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So go ahead and take some time to do this on your own sewing machine so you know where everything is supposed to go so that everything turns out the correct size in the end. So now I'm going to take my pieces, and you absolutely can pin this if you want. You can pin at the top, the bottom, and the middle. I'm just going to go ahead and give these a little stitch across. I think we're going to be nice and good. It's not a huge long seam. Sometimes I get asked why I keep my hand back here. I'm not pulling the fabric. I'm just helping make sure it stays nice and straight as I am sewing through there. But you definitely don't want to be tugging on your fabric because that'll stretch everything all out of place. All right, so now I'm going to set that seam, and that just consists of running your iron over it. It helps the threads kind of lay flat with the fabric that you just sewn and just provides overall better results when you're all done. Now I'm going to go ahead and give this a press as well. And good quality checkpoint, you want to make sure that your angle is going straight up, because this should be kind of a nice straight line. Obviously it's not straight up and down, but it should be a straight angled line going from your bib piece to your trim piece. Now with your iron fully on that apron front, you're going to want to drag up. That is going to allow you to press that seam underneath and not have any gaps or bumps or anything that will make it not turn out the size that it should be. What last thing you want to do is just kind of like plop it on top of there, because then you can press pleats in. It's just not a great idea. I'm going to do that for the front as well. All right, now for our front piece only, we need to apply some interfacing. So what I like to do is, you always want to iron with the interfacing underneath your fabric, but we're going to want to place it first with the interfacing this way. I really like using woven interfacing because it is fabric with fusible attached to it, so it behaves really well. And that's what I'm using here. Now you should have a 1/2 inch open both on your top and your bottom. That's going to help your seam allowances not be so bulky, but it should go all the way out to the sides like we see here. So this is looking really good. Everything's nice and centered, but I don't want to iron it on at this point, because just in case you accidentally flipped it the wrong way and you have the interfacing facing up at this point, it's a lot easier to get it off of your ironing surface than it is to get it off of your iron. So what I'm going to do here is flip this so that the right side of my fabric is up. So that way you should have your fabric with right side up, the bumpy or fusible glue of your interfacing facing up, and the correct side that does not have any glue facing down. So now I'm just going to fuse this. You're going to want to follow your own instructions that came with your fusible interfacing, but for most of them, you're just going to hold your iron in place for a few seconds and gradually move around the piece till it is all stuck together. What I like to do is kind of start in the middle like this, and then work my way out, just kind of going back and forth. This is not like an iron all over stage, although I'll do that once I have everything fused, just as one final like heat press. But you are just gently moving it in a methodical way to make sure you're hitting every piece. And what the interfacing is going to do, if you haven't used it before, is it's going to stiffen your fabric slightly and give it more body, which is going to make it retain its shape longer, make it more durable, which is exactly what we want from a kitchen apron, because let's face it, that those can take a little bit of abuse. Okay, so what I'm going to do before I go any further is I'm going to flip it over, and you usually can tell really easily if something hasn't fused. There'll be like bubbles of fabric coming up where it just hasn't attached, and this is all really good. Like when I'm kind of picking and scratching at this, it is all behaving as one piece, which is what you want to see. All right, so now we're going to layer these right sides together, and we're going to pin across the top and sew it again with a 1/2 inch seam. And because we were a 1/2 inch away from where that interfacing was, that should give you a pretty good guide of where your seam should be. Whenever I'm doing nice straight seams like this, I really am just going to pin at the corners and the center, and that is more than good enough to keep everything together. But if you feel like you need more pins, then use more pins. All right, so now we're going to take this and flip it right sides together, and we're going to press this top seam so that it is flat across. And that should be really nice and crisp because of the interfacing in there. So that will make it real nice and stiff up top. And you kind of want to look from the top here, because if there's any kind of roll where those seams are coming together, you want it to be going toward the lining side of the apron so that you just see the nice front from the front of it. And I don't like to put water in my iron. Everyone I've ever put water in has eventually spit nasty gunk out of it. So what I do instead is I keep water in a spray mister, and I'll just hit that, and then I go over it with an iron. So you get the effect of steam with that nice crisp finish without having to risk your iron getting nasty over time. Now you can have a lot of fun with your thread stash here, because the next thing we're going to do is top stitch along this lining. So I'm going to switch out my thread so that way I have it matching with what we have here. So we're just going to top stitch real close to the edge here, just to make sure that these layers are held together, they stay nice and stiff, and add a little bit of decorative flair to it as well. Now when I top stitch, I like to set my machine to move as far over to the side as I can with that needle. That way I can keep the edge even with the edge of my presser foot like I'm used to doing with sewing, but I have a line to follow and I'm really close and within that seam allowance. I also want to increase my stitch length to about a 3.0 because it doesn't need to be a tight piecing stitch. It just needs to hold it together and look pretty. So as I'm sewing, I'm really making sure to keep the edge of that seam even with the edge of my presser foot so I can have a nice even stitch appearance. There also are edge stitching feet that you can get, or you could use a 1/4 inch stitch that has a guide on it. All of those things can help you keep where you need to be. Well, that is looking pretty cute and coordinated. We are done with the apron bib for now, so we can set it aside until we're ready to do some steps in a little bit. Next, we're going to move on to our pockets. So for your pocket, you should have 2 piece 10s and 2 of your main fabric and of your lining. And what we're going to start doing is we're going to put our, and like I said, I got everything nice and labeled so I know where everything is. We're going to place interfacing on the wrong side of our outer pockets. One tip is to always give everything a really good press right before you fuse it to interfacing, because if you fuse wrinkles in, you're going to have to remove that interfacing in order to get them out. So it's best to just start with nice flat pieces. So just like with that bib front, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by centering my interfacing on the back of the pocket front, making sure that I've got about a 1/2 inch going all around, and that bumpy fusible side should be facing the wrong side of your fabric. Then I'm going to grab it and keeping everything all in place, flip everything so that the right side of the fabric is up. That way, if you screw anything up, you have not fused it to your iron, because that's bad news. Now, following your manufacturer's instructions, go ahead and fuse that interfacing to the fabric. Once you think you have it all fused, just go ahead and flip that over, give it a double check. If you see any sort of bubbles in the interfacing, it means it probably hasn't fused there. You also can kind of scratch at it with your hands, and if anything comes away, then you know you haven't quite fused it. This is looking pretty good though. All right, now we're going to take and we are going to layer everything right sides together with our pocket lining. And we're going to pin around these edges and stitch all the way around. We want to make sure that we leave about a 3-inch opening at the bottom of the pocket though, so we can turn everything right sides out. Here's a quick tip so that you don't accidentally sew too far when you are leaving room to turn, is to put 2 pins about 3 inches apart along the bottom edge. That way you can start at one edge, sew all the way around, and when you hit that second pin, you know you need to stop, backstitch, and leave it open for turning. Now I sew my yellow thread in because it's going to match that pocket lining, but I definitely want to turn my sewing machine back to that regular stitch so that it's dead center and with my regular stitch length. That way I have that 1/2 inch seam allowance again, and I have my regular stitch length back. All right, so starting at that pin that I marked, I'm going to sew about 3 stitches forward and 3 back to reinforce that stitch. That way, when I'm turning everything right sides out, I'm not going to have to worry about accidentally ripping those stitches back, because that's no fun. All right, now we're just going to go ahead and sew our 1/2 inch seam allowance around the entirety of the pocket. It should be right next to where that interfacing is. All right, I'm coming up to that second pin, so I'm going to sew up to it and then do my back stitching forward and back to secure those threads. And since we have 2 pockets, we got to do everything again. Now we need to clip our corners, so that way we're going to be able to get nice sharp points at the edge. So what you want to do is you just want to clip straight across, kind of getting a right angle off that corner. You just want to be really careful that you do not clip through your stitching lines, because then you will not have a corner, you will have a hole. So we want to make sure that you are not doing that. So now we're going to turn this right side out, and this is where that extra stitching at the beginning and end to secure the fabrics is really going to help you out, because if you accidentally get a little overzealous at this point, you're not going to rip out stitches. Now what we're focusing on here is getting our corners nice and turned out so that we have sharp 90-degree angles. What I do is I start by just poking that out with my finger. Then we're going to take a tool, I often use like a mechanical pencil for this with a lead inside, or a knitting needle works, or they actually make corner turners which have pointy ends that you can stick in there as well. I'm going to go find a mechanical pencil and that'll do the job for me here. I'm all about using the tools you have on hand if you can. So I'm just going to push that pencil lead back in, and I'm just going to take and kind of push out that corner. And we got it nice and pointy now. So we're going to have a nice sharp corner. We're going to repeat that for all the others before we press. All right, now you've got your opening here. And what I like to do is just kind of put my fingers in, and our ends are going to kind of curve in. So I'm going to take that and just kind of press that nice and flat. And I've got nice sharp corners here, and I'm going to give it a spritz with my spray mister and then give this a really good press to get everything nice and flat and pointy on those corners. So we're ready to set our pockets aside, and don't worry about this open edge. We are going to grab that when we attach it to the skirt front panel. So you don't have to worry about that just yet. For now, we can just go to the side. All right, so now we're going to be working on making hems that are going on the side and the bottom of our underskirt. This piece is not lined, so from the back, you're just going to see the plain fabric. But what we're going to do is a nice little double fold hem to turn everything under so that we have a nice neat looking edge. I'm going to show you how to do that here. Now, if you have a directional fabric, make sure that the hem you are not going to be turning under, or the side you're not turning under, is the top of the fabric. So if you have like heads of things, like that's the side you're not going to be doing anything on. This fabric, there's nothing that you have to worry about. All right, so this is a double fold hem technique. I'm going to fold over a 1/4 inch, and I have quilted for so many years that I'm going to eyeball this 1/4 inch because I think I got it down by now. Once you get that first one down, and do be careful because the iron can make the fabric a little hot. You don't want to singe your fingertips. What we're going to do is we're going to fold it over again so that this raw edge is now tucked under in that fold. And so we just have still a little 1/4 inch that's just turned to the back that's visible, but you're going to be taking up a 1/2 inch total because you've got the 1/4 inch that's visible, and then you have the 1/4 inch that's tucked underneath. And then we're going to just stitch down this and be able to create a lovely little finished off edge. Now, when you're working at a corner like this, there's a really easy way to create a miter, so that way you are not seeing any raw edges anywhere on that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first unfold the one eye piece, and we can see our folded edges there. And I'm going to first do my fold up of my 1/4 inch, and we're going to do that press down a few inches or so. I just want to be able to get everything pressed and in place. Then we're going to flip it up one more time. All right, now when we unfold this, we're seeing a series of lines here, and I'm going to actually mark this so you guys can see it. So here is our folded edge. That's our second fold. And then we have another one here and here. These are friction gel pens, and this is still a little hot, so it is not turning under as best we can. So what we want to do is have everything meet really well in the center here. So essentially we have to cut off that center in order to make it happen. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to slice straight across right here, right where these folds are all meeting. And that should allow everything to turn in real nicely and not have any raw edges. So now that allows us to fold in along where this X is. Create that kind of miter right there. All right, so now that I folded that back, I'm going to go ahead and fold this in along that 45-degree line. And I'm going to fold it in twice to hit my centers like this. And then on the other side as well. And you may have to do some fussing around to make sure that this meets at a nice little miter. But your goal here is to create a nice little point there that we can pin in place. That way we can stitch around and not have any raw edges. All right, so now we're ready to just stitch all the way around here. I'm going to use an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, and I'm going to use thread that is going to match with my outer fabric because it is going to be visible. Now with the wrong side up, I've set my sewing machine to sew an 1/8 of an inch stitch, and I'm just going to go all the way around that edge. When you come to those corners, make sure you slow down and that you're able to do any last minute adjustments to make that miter as neat as possible. And then you're going to stitch until you hit the miter's meet. And then if you have the ability to keep your needle down, do that, because then you can turn everything and then just keep on stitching. All right, we've got our underskirt completed. We have our nice neat hem on the back so we don't have to line it. We're going to set this aside for now and we're going to work on our overskirt. All right, so you should have an overskirt piece that is going to be visible, and you should have a lining piece that is just that. It's going to be on the lining. So for this one here, this particular fabric, it's not directional, but there are really clear lines to the way all the leaves are going. So I definitely did the same fussy cutting that we did for that bib that had the circles. I did the same thing here to make sure that I had a nice straight edge on the bottom. So in the end, it wouldn't look like the leaves are going crooked because we don't want that. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to open everything up and I'm going to place these right sides together. We're going to pin all the way around and we're going to sew along our edges and our bottom, leaving the top edge open for turning. Now I definitely like to avoid pinning when at all possible, but when I'm going to be dealing with a piece this large, I'm definitely going to take the time to pin out my sides. What I like to do is start with those corners, get those in line first, then I'll hit the middle, and then I kind of distribute everything from there to make sure that everything is nice and even. Now these pieces should be cut to the correct size, so if you are the same size. So if you end up with vast differences, double check your measurements. Make sure that you cut them right in the first place, because this shouldn't be too challenging to get everything to fit up together. All right, so I've got everything pinned together, and one final note before we sew: if you do have a directional fabric, like say the heads all go in one direction, then you want to make sure that that is pointing towards your open top edge. Otherwise, everything is going to be facing down and you're going to have to rip out and do this again. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and stitch all the way around the edges, leaving that top open, and we are using a 1/2 inch seam allowance for this, as we've been doing all along. So this is the edge we're going to eventually be turning. I'm going to make sure that I reinforce the stitches at the beginning and end so that way they don't rip open when I'm turning everything. All right, I've reached the end. I'm going to go ahead and reinforce those stitches as well, just so I've got a real nice sturdy seam there. Now, just like on those pockets, you want to make sure that you are clipping your bottom corners off and pressing them out so they've got really nice points. You're not going to need to do that for the top. That's going to be nice and straight, but make sure you do it here. All right, we're going to flip everything so that it is right sides out. Now, whenever you have really big, long stitches like this, we're going to press it all so it's nice and flat. But I find that it is helpful to kind of run your finger along it too to kind of train those seams. So I just kind of take it and press it out as I am going. And, you know, just any sort of pre-press that you can do is always helpful. All right, I'm going to take the tip of this pen. We're going to press that out. All right, so we got everything with the right sides facing out. This top part is going to get caught up in our waistband later, so don't worry about that. But right now we've got to get everything pressed really well. So since I don't like to use steam in my iron, what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to just spritz this edge really good with my spray mister. It's just water in here. Nothing fancy. And then I'm going to take my fingers and I like to press out as much as I can here to make sure that I've got a nice sharp edge and that the fabric isn't rolling to the front or the back. That's important so that it's going to lay nice and straight when everything is said and done here. And I find that the combination of the spray with the nice hot iron and pressing that seam out with your fingernails gets a really, really nice crisp edge that looks just fantastic. All right, that's looking very good, very straight. Nothing is rolling. It is just meeting nicely on the ends. So I need to do that around my long bottom and my other side piece. All right, it is now time to grab our front panel of our apron and our 2 pockets so that way we can stitch these on before we assemble the rest of our skirt. This might be a little challenging to see because we have the same dark color pocket as we do the back here. So first I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to find the center. It should be 32 inches wide at this point once we account for our seam allowances. So I'm lining the 16 inch of my 6 by 24 inch quilting ruler up with the edge. Now the top of the pocket should be 4.5 inches down from this upper raw edge. So keeping that 16 inch even with that side, I can move that up to get to my 4.5 all the way across. So I know that eventually my pocket is going to sit even with the bottom of this ruler. Now we're supposed to have 10 inches between our pockets, which means that if this is my center and this is where my top of my pocket should be, the edge of my pocket should sit right at my 5-inch mark. So this is a really easy way to pin everything, make sure everything's square. We have 4.5 lined up with that upper raw edge, 16 lined up at the side so we know we're halfway through. And then at the 5-inch mark is where the right edge of that pocket is going to sit. So now I can pin this in place. I'm just going to flip this over just so you can see it super clearly. This is the wrong side, but it'll help you visualize it, I think, a little bit better. Again, 16 inches here, 4.5 on the top, and then 5 inches in is where the right side of that pocket is going to live. Now I'm going to turn it back right side up and also make sure, remember we had that opening, you want to make sure that's on the bottom because we're going to be able to stitch that close when we top stitch this in place. So keeping everything nice and flat, I'm going to go ahead and pin this pocket and I'm going to pin at the top and bottom of that right side and only at the bottom so far of the left side because we're going to be turning this down a little bit to create a little decorative element and a nice little pop of color. And we have to measure up on this side to see where that pocket is going to end. All right, so now I'm going to move my ruler and I'm going to make it even with the bottom of that pocket. Again, might be a little challenging to see at this point, but we want it to come down like so when we're all done. So this tells me where I need to put my pin so that way I can stop at the correct point when we're sewing these in. So I'm just going to take my pin right where that 3.5 was, and then this is my guide. I'm going to start stitching here. I'm going to lock my stitches in place. I'm going to edge stitch around all the way up to the top here and edge stitch that in place. And then in the next step, we're going to be able to fold that down, put a little button here as a nice decorative element, and then also to help keep that pocket flap folded down. Now, once you get one side done, you have to do the same thing on the other side. Now I'm kind of starting like right in the corner here because I want it to be a little free to turn down all the way. So I've set my sewing machine up for an 1/8 of inch stitch because that's what I've been using throughout this entire process. And I've got those seams where I sewed 3 forward and 3 back to lock everything in place. And then keeping the edge of this pocket in line with the edge of my presser foot at all times, I'm going to be able to sew some nice top stitching. I chose a nice black thread for this to match the black background, and it's just going to kind of blend in. That way if it isn't perfect, it won't be super obvious. But we do want to make it as neat as possible. When you get to that bottom, you're going to, with your needle down, pivot everything and turn it. And now your presser foot should be lined up with that bottom. And remember, we're going to be catching that opening so that way we don't have to stitch it closed by hand. we're going to turn one last time, and remember when I hit this pin, that's my stopping point because we're going to be turning this back. We want it to be nice and cute and decorative. Okay, so I've hit my point, so I'm going to stitch my 3 back. And actually this one is just wanting to stay in place. So we'll stitch right in place a few times. And we should be nice and secured at this point. And we're going to do everything on the other side. So now we're going to fold this over and put a little button on here. It's going to be purely decorative. And to keep that flap in place, I'm just going to go ahead and pin through there as well. That way I'm not fighting with that and the positioning of it, and I'll know that it's going to look nice when I put it in there. I'm putting my pin a little bit above where I want to actually sew my button. I think I'm going to go for right here, right above that point. Just, I think it will look aesthetically well there, but you can pick your own location. All right, so for this next step, you're going to need some hand sewing needles, button, and some thread. I'm just using the same black artful thread I've been using for all the top stitching. About an arm's length is plenty. Any more than that, and the thread can knot up and you end up with issues with it. I'm gonna go ahead and give that a snip. Now, typically when I'm quilting, I only sew with 1 thread thickness, but that's not what I wanna do here because we're sewing some buttons on. While they're decorative, we wanna make sure that they're going to also stay in place if there's any strain on them. As you know, you're throwing stuff in them while you're cooking. So I'm gonna go ahead and knot that at the bottom with a knot, so I have 2 thread thicknesses that I'm gonna be stitching through. My grandmother, she used to lick her finger like that and then kind of like roll it and pull it down to get like a really secure knot. This is a really fat, ugly knot, but that is the way she always used to do it when she was showing me how to sew when I was little. All right, so remember, we want this pocket to be usable, so make sure that you are not stitching through this back layer. What I am gonna do though to hide this knot is I'm going to start and then just push it through the back here, and then it'll just be hidden underneath that button where you won't see it because it's all thrown together there. So I'm going to start by just putting my needle through my first one here, kind of decide where I want it to be at this point. The first couple of stitches are important as they kind of determine the placement of your button. I kind of like it in that position. So we're just going to go ahead and push it through that top button. Push that needle through the back, again making sure that we are not going through this backing layer. And then I'm going to come up through those side holes. I went through the up and bottom first. There we go. Takes a little figuring sometimes. That pulled up. We're going to go in the other. And you want to do your best to make sure that it's going straight up and down and straight side to side. If you don't, you know, it's not the end of the world. If somebody points that out on your apron that you made, you know, they're not your friend. They're the quilt police. We don't listen to them. But at this point, we've got it nice and situated. It's looking good. I'm going to go through that 2 to 3 more times before I knot off the thread, and am going to call it good. Because remember, it's not a functional button. It's a decorative button to just help have that little extra pop of color on your pocket. And at this point too, I can remove this pin so we don't poke ourselves because we've got it stitched down. It'll be good to go. All right, so I learned this kind of fun trick. If you take your last stitch and you bring it through the front like that, and you can wrap your threads around a little bit to kind of help secure it just a little more, and then stick it through the back. And then we can do our final knot and bury it inside. So when you're doing your final knot, if you wrap it around your needle, I'm just going to do 2 times here because we have 2 lengths of thickness, and you want that knot to be as close to the edge as possible. If you push it through while pinching it, that makes my knot like real close to the bottom there. It's like right here where my fingernail is. So now I can take this and I can stitch it through the back lining and just bring that needle out a little ways away, give a little pop, and you can almost hear that pop And now the thread is buried away. You're not going to see that knot. And it gives a little bit more security too, because that knot's not visible. It's not anything that can get caught on, and it just looks really nice. All right, I've got to do everything now on the other side. All right, our front panel is completely done. The last thing I need to do is mark my center point, and actually can kind of see where that is because I can see where the fold used to be. So I'm going to go ahead and put a pin up there. This is going to be important for many steps coming forward because we have to match our centers to put it with our other skirt panel, the one that's the underskirt. And then we also have to know where it is when we do our gathers and when we attach it to the waist tie. So just keep, whatever you do next, you want to keep this middle always pinned there. Like, do not remove it, just stitch very carefully over it because we need to know where that middle is at all times until the skirt is completed. All right, so I've got my underskirt now, and I can still see the middle there too from where my fold is. If not, you can always just measure the width of it and be halfway through is where you're gonna put your pin. That's totally fine as well if you can't see it anymore because you pressed it so well. All right, so I'm lining up those top pins right on top of each other, and this is so large we can't see the whole thing at once. But I'm actually going to scooch this over a little bit because I want to make sure that I have equal amounts of the underskirt sticking out on both sides. That's very important coming up. So we've got that together. Ideally, it should be right about even with where those are. So now I'm just going to take one pin and pin through both of those layers because we're going to start the process of joining these. Now the pattern tells you to go straight into the basting stitch. I am a fan of first joining them together. That way if your basting stitches come, like your threads break or something, you still at least have them joined and you're working with them as one unit. So I like that to do that first. I'm not going to do a ton of pins. I just have ones at the edges and that center, which we're going to leave in basically until we're about ready to be totally done with this. And I'm just going to sew an 1/8 of an inch stitch all the way along the top because I want to just get these together as one piece for the gathering step. So I'm going to start just a little bit before where everything is joined, and I'm just going to go ahead and stitch all the way across the top with that 1/8 of an inch stitch that is going to allow us to conceal these stitches within the waistband later. Now the next thing we need to do is sew 2 lines of gathering stitches. The reason why you want 2 is because if one breaks when you're doing this, then you've got to back up and you don't have to start from scratch. Now we tried this with Aurifil thread, and while I have successfully gathered quilting cotton with 1 layer with Aurifil thread, it was not going very well for this. So we are going to be using some jeans thread for gathering because we're going through 3 layers of quilting cotton. It's a little bit stronger thread. You're going to run it up against less issues with breakage when you use the strongest thread that you have available to you. Now you can purchase gathering feet for your sewing machine if you decide that there are a lot of little girl ruffles or aprons in your future, but to do it with just a regular presser foot, we're going to just increase our stitch length to the longest available on your machine, and that's going to create a very loose stitch that you're going to be able to pull and gather up. So I'm going to start still with that 1/8 of an inch stitch because I want this to be again hidden when we insert this into our waistband later. I'll slow down as I come to that pin so I can keep that in place. All right, now when you stop here, don't use like your thread clip or anything. You just want to lift your needle up, leave yourself a real nice long tail because we're going to use that to pull the threads on. All right, I'm gonna move my sewing machine needle back over to a 1/4 inch. We're using a 1/2 inch stitch throughout this entire process. So a 1/4 inch is gonna give me plenty to be able to hide that in later. So again, leaving that really nice long tail, I'm gonna stitch down close to, but not right on that seam from before. You don't really wanna cross them, but next to is great. Now I only replaced the top thread. The bobbin thread is still that Aurifil. So I'm gonna make sure to grab this blue jeans thread here. And what I like to do is just kind of give it a little tug and then spread those gathers down. And it is, I will tell you, a little challenging to get this started, to get the gather to go into that pleat there. And you just kind of want to work it down. And what you can do is you can grab it, give it a little bit of a tug, and then if you kind of just hold that, then you can just smooth the gathers down as you're working. This is a good like Netflix opportunity. What you don't want to do is just like be yanking on this thread as you're pulling this way, because you will break the thread if you do that. But if you grab the edge, like you kind of wrap this around your finger, grab the edge and kind of smooth those gathers down, then you will be getting a longer and longer thread tail here. You're just going to pull a few more inches each time and spread those down. And I like to use this as my guide so that way I can pull this all the way down. Now, this is going to need to fit within our waistband. So we need to get everything from basically the pin to the outer layer down to about 9 inches. And we have a ways to go to get there. But it's just something that you're going to continually work at until it gets smaller and smaller. So you can see that these ruffles are coming in some, but this, I haven't even started to get that far yet. But we're making some progress. That's starting to look good. So I think I'm going to try to spread these ruffles down some, get more towards that center. All right, so when I get this nice and flat, we are currently at about 8.5 inches, which I'm gonna call good at this point. I'll be able to spread that out a little bit when I'm actually inserting it into the waistband, but this is going to be about where I need it to be, and I know that my gathers are going to be nice and even. I'm gonna show you one more thing that will help these lay really nice when you attach your waistband. It's called stroking the pleats or the gathers. So this is not like a must do, like it will still look absolutely great if you don't do this step. But when you have all of these, what you can do is you can just take your needle and kind of run it through your pin rather, and it kind of just gets everything laying nice and flat. So it's like this one in particular is looking kind of lumpy and bumpy. But if we can stroke it, then it kind of gets everything going the direction you want it to, and it'll just look a little neater. Now this definitely takes a little bit more time to do. So if you just have had a really rough go of it to this point, you can totally skip it and it'll look okay. All right, now time to scrunch down the other side. Oops. So this is why you have 2 threads. I just broke one. So thankfully I've got one up here, so I know to slow down and I can work it this way now, and I don't have to start from scratch. So that is a very important thing when you are gathering. All right, so I've got it down to 8 inches from center when I spread this out, about 8.5 again. So again, I'm gonna call that good for right now. I'm gonna have to spread it out a little bit when we go to join the waistband, but this is good enough. And I actually, at first I was thinking the stroking really didn't do too much good, but you can really see a difference in the way that these pleats are laying versus the way that these pleats are laying. So I do think it is worth the time to kind of just go through and just with your pin, go through them and just get them to lay, if anything, down a little bit. You know, sometimes you do this and you just get a clump that just likes to pop up and it just isn't that attractive in the end product. This really kind of helps that just do what it's supposed to do and lay the way you want it to. Because, you know, this is not, you know, this project takes a little bit of effort, and it is an adorable apron when it's all done. It'd be a nice heirloom one. I have an apron that my great-grandmother made and that she hand pleated herself on gingham. So if you take some time with this, like this could be something that gets passed down and that people know that you made lovingly and you are really, they love and cherish. So this is looking a lot better. It's looking a lot smoother. We're ready to move on to our waistband. There is one tiny thing, and this is just, you know, my personal preference. First of all, I'm going to leave these long thread tails from the gathering in place just in case I have to do anything. But I ended up getting a lot of little fuzzies from the threads. Just tugging at this, the fabrics are going to just unravel some, and that's okay. It's not going to hurt anything. But I want to just give them a trim so that I don't have that threaded gobbly mess all over the place. All right, so we're gonna set this to the side for now. We're gonna come back to it once we get our ties on and are ready to assemble our waistband. So if you have a seam gauge, that can be really helpful at this point. What you're gonna do is set it to 1/2 inch. That way we can really easily go around the edges and make sure that we are pressing in 1/2 inch. So we're gonna take our P7, which are our neckties, and we're gonna go around the long edges and press those in 1/2 inch. So you can take your seam guide, take a look, see I'm a little over there, and line that up. Okay, so that's good. So we're gonna start off this little bit, get that corner down. Then, so you're not like going the entire route. What I like to do is spread it down, and I'm about 6 inches down. That's looking good. I can also tell, because this is a striped fabric, and I made sure to cut that so that it would be nice and straight when I was fussy cutting that, that the stripes are kind of folding over right on top of each other. So I know I've done that correctly. So now I've got my 2 reference points here and here that I pressed. So now I'm able to just press in between that. So I'm just gonna work my way down both sides of the strip, doing that, you know, checking my seam every 6 inches or so to make sure that I'm pressing in exactly 1/2 inch. And that way I'm gonna have 2 sides that measure the same and that they look symmetrical when we attach them to the sides of our apron bib. Now that I've got both sides pressed in along that 1/2 inch mark, now we're gonna fold them right sides together, matching up those edges. And because I've got that stripe panel, I'm gonna make sure that I'm matching all of my stripes. I'm actually gonna turn it this way so I can see that a little better. Make sure that they are right on top of each other from top to bottom, and just align all those edges all the way down. Now this is probably an instance where I'm going to take my spray mister and I'm just going to give the whole thing just a little bit of moisture. That way I can help make sure that these presses that I'm putting in are going to stay nice and crisp. As I'm working with them, it'll help everything stay together, and it also will help it look nice and look better over time as well. All right, we've got one more thing to do before we're ready to attach this to the sides of our apron bib. So we're gonna unfold this, and on one side only, we're gonna fold this in to create the finished edge of the top of our ties that'll go behind our neck. Now for this side, we only need to fold in 1/4 inch, and to be honest, it's not gonna be super critical if you aren't exactly at 1/4 because it's gonna be at the back. No one's gonna care if it's a little off. But what you can do now is when you fold this back in and on top of each other, we're going to be able to give it one more press and that will conceal all of our raw edges so that everything will look fantastic as you wear your apron. Now, of course, we've got 2 ties, so I have to do all that again, and so do you. All right, so now it's time to attach our straps to the side of our bib. Now, we want to make sure that the folded over edge, that's going to be at the top because that is our finished edge. Our raw edge is going to be even with the bottom because that's going to get caught up in our waistband a little bit later. So what we're going to do is we're going to open this up, and that fold line right there, that's where we're going to place our edge of our bib piece. Now keep in mind, this is not a straight piece. It is a curved in to go with the lines of your body because we get a little narrower up here. And so it's not going to be like perfectly flat at the bottom, but to make sure that you get it nice and lined up as well as you can, what I'm doing is I'm making sure that the bottom of this point is even with the bottom of my raw edge here. So once that's all in place, you can go ahead and fold it over and get everything pinned in place. Now when you're pinning, make sure that you are getting all of the sides. We want to make sure that they're kind of even with each other. That way the top stitching looks good from both sides when we go over this. Now if you wanted to pin all the way up, you could. The only thing I'm going to pin is this top bit here because I want to make sure that all those little raw edges are kind of tucked in there and that everything stays the way it should be. And I'm just going to put a pin in there to kind of keep that in place. Now everything else, I mean, you certainly could pin, especially if you are worried about, like, you have stripes like this, you're worried about them coming apart. But this part I'm not so worried about. I'm mostly worried about this section because we want to make sure that that bib is going all the way out to the fold. All right, I'm going to do the same thing for the other side, then we're ready to top stitch. One last thing you might want to do before you go put this on is just kind of feel with your fingers to make sure you feel like the bottom of this is about in the same spot as the top, because we want to make sure as we do our top stitching that we are going to catch both of those layers and not have a little bit flapping out in no man's land underneath because we couldn't see it when we were sewing and we got it out of alignment. All right, so I've changed my thread back to the black, which matches this really well and coordinates. I'm going to go ahead and set that to that 1/8 of an inch stitch I've been using to top stitch. You could also use an edge stitching foot for this in order to get really close to the edge of this, or you also could use a 1/4 inch stitch that has a guide on the end. I'm just going to line everything up with the edge of my presser foot and go slow and steady to make sure everything looks really nice. So I'm going to set up again to that 1/8 of an inch stitch, and I'm going to increase my stitch length to 3.0. This is holding everything together, but it is also decorative, so you don't need it to be as tiny as, say, a piecing stitch for quilting. All right, so I'm just going to start down here, remove my pins as I come to them, and stitch all the way up that strap. I'm going to say it one more time. When you see my hand back here, I'm not tugging on this fabric. I'm just helping guide it because we've got a lot of layers here. I'm just trying to make sure that everything stays put and feeds nice and evenly through my sewing machine. All right, we're coming to that tip. So I'm sewing all the way to the edge, and then with my needle down, I'm going to turn and stitch across the edge here. Now, since this is the end, I'm going to want to make sure I backstitch because this is an area that's going to get a lot of kind of use and abuse because this is where we're going to be tying it behind our neck. We want to make sure that it's really secure. Now we need to do the same thing for the other side. The difference is in order to keep it even with the edge of my foot, I'm going to need to start on the strap this time. So I'm going to need to backstitch to start. Turn that corner first and then work my way down the strap to the bib. All right, we've got our bib on with our ties. We're doing pretty good. We are ready to start making our waistband now, then we can join everything together. One quick thing I'm going to do here, just because this wasn't straight, I'm going to go ahead and give this a little trim. That way I'm dealing with something that is nice and straight across. A little bit later when we go to attach these, I want this to be a nice straight line. All right, so I'm going to set this aside with my skirt for now while we get our waistband together. So at this point we should have 4 piece 8s and 2 piece 9s. These piece 8s are folded over. This is what's going to go around your back to tie. And the piece 9, that's the one that's going to go right around our stomachs. And we want to put a little bit of interfacing on the part that's going to be facing out to give it the same stability that that bib apron has. So just like before, we want to iron it with the glue side of the interfacing facing up, but I want to align it with it facing down. That way I can get everything lined up, but I won't run the risk of accidentally getting the fusible on my iron. So I've got the wrong side of the fabric facing up here, and I'm going to put the fusible side, or that bumpy, shiny side, face down, making sure to align it pretty much dead center with everything here. We should have about a 1/2 inch for that seam allowance going around on all sides. Now, if it's not perfect, it certainly is not the end of the world. But what I'm going to do is grab that with my fingers and flip it over, and then just kind of feel to make sure that it stayed in place, and it did pretty well. So now I'm going to go ahead and fuse that. Follow your manufacturer's instructions for fusing, but usually you just need to keep the iron down for a few sections, and you kind of want to slowly move it from one section to another. You're not ironing a shirt here. You're trying to just get it fused nice and flat down. I like to go over kind of a second time usually. Then when you're all done, you can flip it over and you can kind of like scratch at it. And if anything comes up or you kind of see any bubbles, that means that it didn't quite fuse in that spot, and we've got a little bit more work to do with that iron to get it ready. All right, so now we've got our waist seam that's going to be for the back, and that has no interfacing. And we have our one that's going to be for the front, and that has a little bit more stability with that interfacing. Now we're going to take 2 pieces that are going to be the waist ties, and we are going to stitch those along the short edges here. And we're going to do that for both of these pieces, for the front and the back. This is going to create basically the front and the back of the waist tie. So the first thing we're going to just do is just feed a bunch of these guys through the sewing machine with that 1/2 inch stitch. We're back to that again. And we're just going to get these all together here. So we now have 2 really long waistband straps with our smaller centerpiece in the center, and then the longer ties for the back on the sides. We're going to press these seams open, and then we're ready to assemble and sew together the edges of that waistband. We're almost there. We're about ready to put this all together. So now we need to pin these together, and I definitely read the pattern instructions several times before I attempted to do this to make sure I understood every single aspect of how we're going to get the skirt and the apron bib in here. So between looking at that closely and watching this video, you should be able to execute this with no problems. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip these guys right sides together, and we've got our straps here, and we at this point do not want to sew at all in this middle section. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to line them up. That way they'll be lined up for later when we are going to sew them. But we actually aren't going to sew within that area at all right now. We're actually going to start sewing about 2 inches beyond that. But I do want to get them pinned together. That way I know later everything is going to look pretty good. But I'm not going to pin at all within here because I want to have that assurance to myself that, no, Stephanie, it's not time to pin or sew in there just yet. So just like when we did the pocket and we put a pin at that 3.5 inch mark, so we knew not to sew over it so that pocket could kind of fold down. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to put a stop pin. So we're going to put pins on both sides here about 2 inches beyond where that seam is. This is where we're not going to sew beyond when we stitch the edges of our tie together. So we're going to stitch all the way around this tie, starting and stopping at these pins, leaving this area completely undone, and then do the same thing on the other side. That way we're going to be able to turn the outside of the waistbands, leaving this free to insert our bib and our skirt. Now this is just a real nice straight seam, so I'm really just going to pin just a teeny bit on these because it shouldn't be too difficult to get everything sewn together and not have anything shift on us. Then we've got to repeat everything on the other side. All right, so here's the seam of that waistband. That's the section we're not going to sew yet. So I'm going to start where I put those pins. Now this is kind of arbitrary. You just kind of need to leave about 2 inches of space so that way you have room to turn everything and get everything inserted. Now we're going to sew that 1/4 inch seam or 1/2 inch seam. And I'm going to reinforce those stitches because since we are going to turn, I don't want to rip them and have them come out. Once you hit a 1/2 inch, make sure you go ahead and leave that needle down and turn everything to the side. Then you can start stitching down to pivot on the other side. All right, so I've reached that warning pin that I'm 2 inches away from where this seam is. So that's where I'm going to take everything out. I'm going to reinforce those stitches, and that's where I'm going to stop on this part of that waist tie. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Now for right now, I'm going to go ahead and take these pins out because we've got a lot of fussing to do. I don't want to stab myself. They were just there to help make sure that those were going to line up perfectly when we were all said and done. So just like when we worked on the pockets, the next thing we want to do is clip off those corners. So that way when we turn everything right sides out, we have a really nice point there. And you want to clip close to the stitching line, but not through it. Do that for both sides. All right, so now we're going to take this opening and we're going to pull this whole bit out. This is going to take some doing. You kind of got a lot to push through there, but it's doable. Once you kind of get it started like that, it's kind of easiest to kind of stick your fingers in and hold from the back and pull. There are also tools that make this easier. If you see a lot of these in your future, you can get a tube turner and that will be helpful. So obviously this thing is much longer than my pointy utensil, my pencil that I've been using, but I can easily drop it in and get it back out. So what I did is just pushed it all the way down to the tip, and then I can still work it to push that corner out gently. Do the same thing on that other side. So I've got a nice pointy corner. Then I can just drop her back out. So if you've got something that's short and pointy, like they make tools that are actually point pushers, but this mechanical pencil also has worked really well for me for this project. All right, I gotta do the other side, then we're gonna press. So the center waist part that we have not done anything to, we do not want to turn that right sides out. We don't want to press it. We just want to pretend we didn't do anything to it so far. But we do want to press these ties and get them ready for a little bit later. So I'm going to go through and spritz both sides with my spray mister. That way it'll hold that press really nicely. And I'm just going to go through this 1/2 at a time using my fingernails to press that seam all the way out to the edge. That way that join, that seam is going to be right on the edges and not roll to the front or back. I'm just going to take my time doing that one side at a time. All right, this is where I stop sewing. It's open from here on out, so I'm not going to press any more of that. I'm going to flip it over, and I'm going to now press this side and then repeat everything with the other half of the tie. All right, so I finished pressing my ties, but we want to make sure that these guys here are still right sides together. So our ties are gonna kind of be hanging out, looking a little weird right now. And there's one more thing we need to do here. We need to make sure that the interfacing side is facing up because we want that to end up right sides together with the front of our skirt here. That way we have that extra stability in the front of the apron. So remember, we kept this pin in the center because that way we can align our centers here. So what I'm going to do is just take my edges here and fold it over so that those seams meet in the center. And then I'm able to just kind of press that over, figure out where my center is, and I can put a little pin in here as well. And that's going to tell me where my center is. So we're pretty good in that situation. All right, so now this is a part that I read a few times before I did it. So make sure you read it, make sure you understand it when you're looking through your instructions, which again, you can get from an SIY retailer at siysewityourself.com. There are local quilt shops you can go to, as well as online retailers that you can get the pattern from. And you also can get it at sewforhome.com. So what we're going to do here is we're going to put this inside and pin it all together and then stitch across this top edge. All right, so what we want to do is slide this in. And these top edges here, they've got to meet. So I've got my center and my center, and I want those to be right on top of each other. So I'm going to pin right there through both of them. Then I also want to find my center for the back here. And I can see my fold mark. We can create it here real easily. Just going to fold that in half. We've got it pinched, so I can take a pin that isn't holding everything together and mark that. So now I know that this is going to go against the wrong side of that underskirt. So now I can line those up, and now I know that I have everything pinned through all 3 layers. That's really important. And I've got my centers matched through all 3 layers. Now, next I'm going to work my way out to the sides here, because this edge here, the underskirt lining, that should be even with where our seam allowance is right here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pin that in place right there. I'm going to do the same thing for the other side. So now we can grasp these edges and kind of start to spread this out a little bit. This is where it's a little easier to come in a little too much when you do your gathers than go in too far. And I actually just broke a thread there, which is not good. So I'm going to have to manually kind of pin this in, trying to keep hold of the gathers. And this is why, again, you got 2 threads, because if one breaks, then the other should kind of hopefully hold everything in place as you get working on that. So that way you can have a nice even look. But what I'm doing right now is I'm just pinning all these top edges together. So I'm hitting the top waistband that has the interfacing, and I've got my skirt, and then I've got my bottom edge of that waistband too. So we're going to just work on pinning this in and getting it in place. All right, so this is where my threads just broke. So rather than go through and do all that again, I'm just gonna pin a whole lot and kind of recreate those gathers myself. It won't look as good as the parts where it is fully gathered in, but it's gonna be a small area, so I think I can make it look decent and it won't be too noticeable that it's off. But definitely be careful as you're working in this step. You don't want to undo all your work that you did with your gathers. All right, this time I'm going to more gently smooth those gathers over to give myself a little bit more room. I need that extra ½ inch that I came in too far on. That is looking much better. All right, I've got everything pinned. Just to recap, we've got our waistband with the interfacing on top, with the right edge facing the front side of our skirt, and then our skirt lining is lined up with the edge here, and then we have our back on the back there. So when everything is stitched together, this is going to stitch straight up and we're going to be good to go there. And one thing that I noticed, so I've done a lot of ruffling and gathering because I make little dresses for my daughters all the time with quilting cotton, and this method of doing that stroking, this is the first time I've done it with quilting cotton, it really makes everything lay nice and straight across here. So I don't know if you guys have ever done this before, where it's like constantly like poking out of the side and you know you're losing like length by doing that. This really makes it lay super nice and flat. So I'm interested to see how well this looks when we stitch it out, because I'm really quite pleased with how it's behaving at this point. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to stitch. I'm going to start a little bit before and end a little bit after where these waistbands are. I'm not going to be able to go too far beyond because of this weird turny thing that's going on right now, but just enough to where we can enclose all of these raw edges and be able to press that up. Now, when you do this, you do want to make sure that your ties are very far out of the way so that you don't accidentally stitch them in, because that would be no fun at all. I'm going to go ahead and back stitch to get started just so that's nice and secure. And then we're going to start going over. I'm going to remove all the pins as I come to them. I really don't want to stitch over them. I've had a pin break on me before, and the needle went straight towards my eye, and thankfully the thread was still on it, so it stopped before it made it that far, but I will never do it again. All right, I've reached beyond that, so I'm going to go ahead and back stitch before I take this off. All right, guys, this is kind of our moment of truth to see how those ruffles went. We're going to pull that up, and oh, that looks good. I am really pleased with how this turned out. So this is a side where I had that basting stitch break, and I kind of repinned everything to mimic the ruffle. And this is the side where everything worked out just fine. So this one looks really great. Those ruffles are really neat and tidy, kind of going across, are all evenly spaced in a nice tiny way. This one, you can tell that it's not quite the same. This is where it was doing just fine. And this from here to here is where my thread broke, and I kind of made it work. So we ended up with a big chunk right here, which isn't super ideal, but you know what? It'll look fine in the end. It's evenly distributed when we put everything together. So I'm calling this good. I'm going to give it a press, and then we are ready to move on to adding our bib and finishing this. I try not to press the ruffles down too much. I really want them to kind of have body. So I'm just kind of hitting that top area some. So once you have your waistband pressed up, there's a couple other areas we need to press to get ready to finish this entire thing. So remember, we left a little opening here. So these edges really just kind of want to fold in. So you just want to kind of press them in place, help them stay there. So that way we can top stitch that later and have it look great. There's also going to be an opening on the other side to do the same thing with. Now I'm going to grab my seam gauge again because I need to open up this waistband, and I need to press it in 1/2 inch as well, all the way across the top. That way we can insert our bib in the top and just top stitch across this entire waistband, and we're done. I'm going to kind of start in the center, I think, here. On the interfacing side, you kind of get away with not measuring because the interfacing should end 1/2 inch away from the edge of that fabric. So you can just fold it over to meet the edge of the interfacing and give it a press. All right, we've now reached our final step where we're going to insert our bib lining with our center here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find my center just by folding this over. And I'm going to put a pin where that is, just so I've got a nice line to go for. And then I'm also, again, going to find my seams where my waistbands end. I'm going to fold that over so I can get my center waistband as well. So that is going to go right here. Now, matching those two areas up, I'm actually going to take another pin because this is going to insert in here, but I still want to be able to see that I'm on center. So I'm actually just going to put a pin going straight up and down here. That way I can see that I'm on center, but I'm not sticking a pin in the middle of everything. that will be in the way when we sew. So what we want to do when we insert this is have the bottom of our bib meet up with the top of where our seam allowance is for all of these gathered stitches. So I'm going to line that up just like this so that it really is like just touching right there. And then when I pull that up, I can scoot it over a little bit so that way I am making sure that I'm meeting center like that. So now I'm going to take that pin and I'm going to pin through all the layers. So I went through my waistband front, my apron, and also my waistband back. And I'm going to do the same thing on the edges here. Make sure everything is nice and lined up. Make sure my tops are meeting at about the same spot here. That feels pretty good. You want to make sure that these waistband edges are at the same spot because they're going to need to, just like when we did our upper straps where they need to meet, they also need to meet here as well. So now let's do the same thing over here and pin through all those layers. Now I'm going to hit a couple other strategic points as we pin this section here. Now remember, we don't have too much because we have this whole section pinned already, but I do want to make sure that my seams are going to meet pretty well right here where that upper waistband is. And same thing on the other side. All right, so now we're going to top stitch around the entirety of our strap. We're going to go all the way down, turn at the edge, and then make our way all the way back until we meet at the center. And what that's going to do is it's going to enclose any raw edges that we have left here on the sides, as well as attach our bib to the skirt and waistband. And then we're done and we get to try this baby on. Now whatever stitch you've been using for top stitching, you want to switch to that. Same if you've been using like the same thread color for this whole section. Now I'm going to start just a little bit before where I stop stitching on that waistband. That way it's in a little bit of an inconspicuous spot because I am going to have to sew over that when we're all done. I don't really want it to be front and center. So I'm really just going to take my time, and it helps. This is pretty heavy at this point. We have a lot of yardage in this. We've got some interfacing, and it's very dense at that skirt. So take some time, get the weight of the apron as much as you can on your table. And just as you're going through this top part, getting everything pinned together, making sure that you can feel underneath, that everything is folded under the way it should be, and that you're catching all your pieces. All right, I made it through all the parts that needed to be closed up except for the tiny little holes back here, but that's just really small. So at this point, I can kind of rock and roll going around the edges. Again, just making sure that I am keeping in line with the edge of that presser foot. All right, so I've made it all the way around. I've done a little back stitching just to tack that in place, and we're ready to take a peek at this. All right, so this apron is looking really adorable. I love how it's looking from the front. We do have to check one thing from the back though, and I know that I need to do a little adjustment. So depending on how good of a job you did at following your 1/2 inch, you may not have caught your entire background here. I did not with mine. So what I like to do whenever I'm doing dresses for my daughters is when I have something like this to do, I like to stitch that down by hand. It really, I think, adds a nice little touch, and then you know everything is going to be placed right where you want it to be. Other options, if you don't want to do that, is you could pick it out, repin, and redo that section. You could take another stitch going around everything, this time coming in a little bit more, and you might hit that more. But I'm just going to stitch it by hand and call it a day, and it won't take very long at all. So when I'm stitching something like this down by hand, I use pretty much the exact same stitches that I would if I'm sewing quilt binding. So what I'm going to do to start is just go ahead and take my needle and I'm going to bring it up through the fold back here a little bit, because I did catch it at the beginning, but not all the way through. So I want to bring it up through the fold. That way my knot can be hidden underneath everything. And my extra little bit of thread that comes off of there. So now I can just take this and I can hold this section and I can put my needle in right where it came out, where that thread came out. And I'm putting my needle through so that it's coming through the lining fabric and the waistband, but I can't see it from the front. That's really important. We do not want to see this from the front at all. And you can just keep on stitching this way until you make it across. And I've got some milliners here, some betweens would have been better to work with. They're a little bit smaller, but you're just going to keep on stitching like that, really feeling every single time you take that stitch to make sure that it's not coming through from the other side. And you can even see, like, even though I'm using black thread here and none of the fabric is black, you cannot see it. If you do this stitch well, it is going to be pretty invisible when everything is said and done. All right, I've gotten all the way to the end, so I'm just going to finish that up with a quilter's knot so I can bury it within that waistband, and then no one will ever be able to tell that I messed that up just a smidgen as I was working on it. That's like half of sewing, is knowing when you make a mistake, how do I fix that and have it still look good but not have to take everything apart. So that is a very valuable skill to master. I hope that you guys have really enjoyed making the bib and double skirt patch pocket apron. The pattern is available from SIY retailers. You can find one near you or an online retailer if there isn't one near you at SIYSewItYourself.com. While you're there, make sure to check out all of their ideas for different sewing projects that you can do, so that way you can improve your sewing skills and sew it yourself. You also can get the pattern and a bunch of other tutorials from sewforhome.com. They're the ones who designed this, but make sure you can get obviously fabric from your stash, you can get fabric from anywhere, but do try to support an SIY sponsored company. They are from the Jaftex family. That's FreeSpirit Fabrics, Henry Glass, Blank, and Studio E. They are the ones that are putting together kits using their fabrics, so that way you can get an idea and know that it's going to look good when it's done. If you like the way it looks in the picture, you are going to be able to make it look good on you as well, because you know what fabrics to use, where to put them, all the good things. And I think that this is just such a fun project. And really, I've said it before, an apron can be an heirloom project. I have an apron that I received from my mom that was my great-grandmother's, that she hand smocked using gingham fabric, and she gave that to me when I got my first house, and I still use that today. It's like my special occasion apron. If I'm cooking a big dinner and it's fancy, that is the one that comes out. And I gave my mom an apron several years ago when I first learned to sew. She still uses that every Christmas when she's baking cookies. So this is a really practical item, but it also can be an heirloom item because it's the one that, you know, great-grandma always used, or grandma always used when she was baking cookies, and or someone made it for me in my colors to match my kitchen, and so I'm going to use that all the time. And so this is really a fun project. It's adorable and like very much 1950s housewife vibes from this project, because it is flouncy. You got the ruffled skirt, you have the patch pockets with the little detailing here with the button and the fold down pocket, and you have the opportunity to show off a lot of really fun fabrics. So make sure you check it out. Grab your fabric from a Jaftex member company to say thanks for the ideas and all of the instruction that goes along with that. All right, well, thank you for following along. We've got more on the way for you, and until next time, happy quilting.